Welcome to another edition of the Civ Battle Royale. My name is Dawkinzz, and this is episode 37, The Path Between Worlds. As the cylinder rolls towards a new and even bleaker future, the remaining civilizations battle it out for the final scraps as the world burns around them. This is a very special episode, and I'll get into that in a moment, but let's get right into this. Welcome to the final pre-endgame part of CBRX Season 1. I'm Chris, known on the sub as User Autistic Not Weird, and whoa, this part has been a challenge to narrate. While I have the opportunity during this one non-fiction slide, let me explain what you're in for. Those who saw my post last week, skip forward. 2 weeks ago, Coyote posted on the sub explaining how getting images after turn 700, or enough images to fill whole parts as we're accustomed to, has been impossible. He has, however, managed to salvage some maps, so that's what we have between turns 700 and 900. After that, nothing was salvageable until the game's final turn, so essentially this part will have maps every 5 turns from 700 to 900, and one map for 1024. But rather than this whole part being nothing but pixelated maps, I've tried to do something different and more engaging, and hopefully something that does justice to this tournament so far. Introducing lore, narrative, OC, and look back during these final days of the battle as we know it. And once in a while, user Greg9 will be jumping in with some interesting bits of statistical analysis. And while I'm at it, special thanks to user Laxaraxariscal and user WTH Are You Doing? WTH Are You Doing? Very PC. For their lore maps, which have been priceless for finding city names in a part filled only with maps. And now, going into fiction mode to cover this tournament's past, its present, and its future, let me tell you a story that shaped a world. The painting looked beautiful on the wall of Pedro's office. They always did. He steadied it so it hung perfectly straight and took a step back. Private Varia had gifted him these world maps since time immemorial, and they were always a joy to receive. They gave life and culture to the events on his pixelated screen. Thousands of years on a submarine in the Atlantic, and Pedro never tired of watching his world. It was duty in its purest form. The thought of thousands of years had never felt imposing to Pedro. He had already lived through enough millennia. His experience of subduing and ruling his first cylinder had proven him to be the perfect successor to the great Nebuchadnezzar. He had demonstrated all the qualities of the ideal observer: patience, resilience, and the willingness to take extreme action when necessary. The passing of the torch had been the most defining day of his life, caught on camera by a photographer known only by his professional name, Jru247. That was the problem with painted maps. They quickly became outdated. Within 5 years of it hanging on the wall, the Chin had made landfall onto mainland Shikoku territory. The formerly Korean peninsula did not look likely to hold either, a huge twist in fate for a civilization that had previously surprised everyone with its competence. Greg's note: one Shikokan city has been removed from existence, likely from excessive nuking, and not to stack bad news on top of bad news, but the last remnants of the Aztec army died on turn 701. They made it to the last episode, though. Another 5 years passed, and Pedro rose from his seat to take a walk along his submarine. Wherever he did, he was struck with equal feelings of safety and vulnerability. Safety because he and his crew were deep underwater and sheltered behind enormous Antarctic mountains, which themselves were guarded by vast ice shelves. Vulnerability because their submarine was the one unit holding the cylinder together. Pedro did not know all the details or any of the science behind nuclear tectonic bonding, but if his submarine were ever to vanish, the cylinder's turns would end, and all life would perish. Another 5 years passed, and Pedro rose from his seat to take a walk along his submarine. Wherever he did, he was struck with equal feelings of safety and vulnerability. Safety because he and his crew were deep underwater and sheltered behind enormous Antarctic mountains, which themselves were guarded by vast ice shelves. Vulnerability because their submarine was the one unit holding the cylinder together. Pedro did not know all the details or any of the science behind nuclear tectonic bonding, but if his submarine were ever to vanish, the cylinder's turns would end, and all life would perish. Some days, Pedro wished the whole world had stayed small, that the oceans had remained untouched, and that the fighting was still done with wooden arrows instead of photon lasers. He thought back to the millennia where no human had set foot on the Hawaiian Islands. A historian called Mr. Clonam had once written a detailed tome of those days, before the colonization of them had sparked the end of the cylinder's paradise era. Greg's note: the cylinder has grown so populated that it is impossible for the sub's complex software to carry out an accurate census. Many civs have reached the magical number of 2.1 billion plus citizens. Currently, the cylinder's population is around 40 billion people. For reference, IRL Earth has a population of roughly 7 billion. Wow. As Pedro dreamed about bows and arrows, the Korean peninsula fell to laser robots. The final city of Hwangju on the coast held the last of the dying Shikoku soldiers. Meanwhile, Zimbabwe stole 2 Uruguayan colonies, and New Zealand did their best to stay relevant by irritating the Nazca. Pedro had always admired that about Sudan. Whether his empire had been weak or strong, he had consistently fought with the ambitious aggression of a superpower. It reminded him of how the Shia had once been. The only difference was that Sudan had succeeded and you had died. When Pedro thought about it, the Shia were a fine representation of what winners needed to be. Fearing no enemy, being far too ambitious, and taking risks that would end in either glory or death. Either being better than existence as a turtled state. The Shia had held the right attitude to conquer the whole world, and had they not been snuffed out so early, perhaps in an alternate world they could have done so. The Qin, largely held responsible for Shia's downfall, even though Canton had finished them off, continued to show why they had earned the dead civs' lands. They lay waste to Shikoku capital of Kochi, an impossible feat a mere 100 years earlier, and spread north in an attempt to cut their remaining empire in two. Uruguay, fresh from losing the Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince to the Iroquois, took the city of Okangala from the Nazca, having long separated it from the rest of its empire. The strategy of splitting up empires was not a new one, although it had rarely been done well. Back in the days when Algeria had been settling cities exclusively to annoy their neighbors, Pedro had gone to bed and dreamed up this perfect analogy for what the Algerians were doing. Well, in his dream, it had been explained to him by an albino riding a dino, but either way it had made him laugh. The next time Pedro awoke from a dream, the world had changed. Not because of Uruguay's Hall of Three Cities, including Port-au-Prince, not because of the banishment of the Nazca from New Zealand's lands, and not even because of the final fall of the Korean peninsula. Not even because Venice, after enough time to try any immortal's patience, had finally broken through the Balkan mountains and taken Bursa from the Ottomans. But because the much-loved Selknam, whom Pedro had enjoyed watching for thousands upon thousands of years, had been snuffed out by the Nazca Navy. The Selknam had never been a contender for the entire cylinder thanks to the sheer power of Uruguay, and in Pedro's experience, civs based in Uruguay's part of the world tended to do well, but they had been entertaining to watch. High ambitions, occasional competence, and a damn scary-ass culture. Pedro, hoping that the last Selknam had safely come to rest in the loving arms of Cthulhu, reached for his keyboard and searched his database for the folder of Funeral Arrangements for Former Immortals, which he found immediately by pressing F. God bless you, Selknam. You were very cool. Even with eternity on his side, Pedro often found himself too busy. With the death of Shoon Unte barely dealt with, he found himself witnessing the burning of the Beta Israeli city of Salalah, the Nazca pushing further into the Pacific, and the death of another immortal. Edirne had fallen. Mehmed and his Ottoman Empire had been put out of their misery by Alaric and the Goths. The Ottomans, to their credit, had survived longer than they had earned any right to. Their whole civilization had become a living museum, a people who had fought well and even killed Minos in their early days and spent the rest of their years just surviving so those old stories could be passed down. And it had worked. But the question in Pedro's mind was whether those stories would continue now that their living museum was destroyed. Pedro sat upright from his wondering and pressed the F key again. After the death of the Ottomans, the cylinder experienced 5 years of consistent borders. The building of a brand new city by Palmyra was literally the lead story for the cartographers of that period, giving the impression that the world was at peace. How wrong they were. The deception of peace had been around since the beginning. The death of the Shia had been the last extinction for a long, long time, and had led to the crew seeing the cylinder as boring, although nothing could have been further from the truth. Thousands were dying back then, just like millions were dying now, but no nation was going extinct. Club Loser, the comic strip in the submarine newspaper's cartoon page, had contained images of just you, sat alone on a redundant sofa. 5 years of bombings and death followed, and the net result was little beyond coffin sellers getting rich. Palmyra expanded on their own subcontinent, and a Manx general called Kirk Michael had taken back their rightful homeland. Or was the city called Kirk Michael? Or was it named after a Kirk Michael who had founded it or conquered it? Pedro had forgotten. Those crazy Manx. European warfare had always been a little bizarre. With the memories of Mehmed still on Pedro's mind, he remembered the Ottomans' rather bizarre style of warfare and how it had ultimately led Mehmed to his own spot on Club Loser's no longer redundant sofa. As effective as the surviving European civilizations had been, Pedro did not see the continent hosting any ultimate winners. 5 years of nothing followed. The deaths continued, but the borders stayed the same. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were fighting and dying in a race to stand still. That was what war looked like at the end of the technology tree. A long, drawn-out, ferociously advanced stalemate, with the infamous peacekeepers both helping and hindering, depending on each leader's perspective. As much as the advance of technology had made Pedro sad, it helped to remember how misguided they had been without it. Robert the Bruce had been hilariously avoidant of academia, which one would think would have made him focus more on his military prowess. Science mattered back then just as much as it did now, whether it was the invention of writing, the development of the Nexus, or even the creation of the bulletproof cookie. Greg's note: Scotland has the fewest techs of any civ on the cylinder now. Civs like Shia, Korea, Murray had all their units killed. Their most recent discovery was that of simple machines, which they worked out while watching the drones and super soldiers of Greenland fight it out. Pedro kept watch as no borders changed, but he was far from bored. Someday the extinctions would begin again, just as they had after the long post-Shia break, when death had come for Minos. Truth be told, the Minoans had impressed Pedro. Originating on such a tiny island, they were either going to die quickly or be magnificent. Ultimately, they had done both, expanding far wider than they had reasonably been expected to, and fighting far better. It had meant death, but a death worthy of remembrance. Children in modern schools would learn about their history and culture, even if only Pedro and the last remaining immortals remembered them in person. Over the next 5 years, the Nazca took San Jose de Mayo from Uruguay and straightened out their borders. Pedro tried to imagine how many regular low-ranking soldiers had laid dead on the ground for the next wave of soldiers to climb over, their vast numbers led by so few generals who sat back and let their subordinates do the fighting. To be fair, though, that had been where Algeria, caretakers of northwest Moorish Africa, had got it so wrong. Too many leaders, not enough subordinates. You could train your entire population to be great generals, but without the soldiers on the ground, all the barked commands in the world could not save you. True military discipline involved taking orders, not just giving them and expecting obedience. Algeria had not realized this and rued the day when the Moors came. Zenobia woke up from her slumber and took 2 cities from Parthia. Presumably it had also woken up Mithridates, but it was difficult to tell. Pedro had had thousands of years, most of which sat in the same chair, to memorize the world and everything in it, and there were still whole nations he had to consciously make an effort to remember. Libya was one of those, swallowed up entirely by another nation that had also since become extinct. In a world where 60 out of 61 civilizations were sure to die, it was every leader's responsibility to make their existence memorable, and Libya, unfortunately, had failed. Speaking of which, the Cylinder's next 5 years were not especially memorable either. Sorry. But towards the end of them, Pedro's submarine had its first major panic in 9,000 years. A Uruguayan nuclear sub came within discovery distance of the Antarctic mountains, and for 6 months nobody in Pedro's crew had been allowed to speak any higher than a whisper. The first step to the sub's destruction and the collapse of the entire cylinder was others finding out they existed, and if they were discovered, there would be no guarantee of peace. The world's leaders had had no aversion to violence, as they had proven many, many, many times. After the silence, Venice took back Kirkmichael, or killed him. The details were unclear. Those islands were a silly place, filled with silly people and silly leaders. But aside from the catastrophe of Glasgow, Scotland had set out some excellent defense. Building a great wall and carpeting with ranged units would have been a surefire strategy for survival were it not for their neighbors attacking over the water. The Vikings had known where their opponents were weak and struck it with full force. It had been like a warrior spending their whole lives preparing for an epic kung fu showdown, learning every move in the book and building up every muscle in their body, only to have a Viking opponent throw peanuts at them and trigger their fatal allergy. 5 years passed, and the map did not change. Perhaps everyone still on the cylinder had earned their right to stay there. For the most part, those who didn't deserve it were no longer around. It made Pedro remember how not all civilizations were meant for this world. Oman just hadn't been the right fit for such a cutthroat cylinder, hoarding money in the desert as their enemies founded true empires. Hemmed in by Palmyra along their peninsula, they had become helpless as their enemies, just like with Scotland, had attacked from the sea. It was a lesson most other civilizations had taken to heart. Develop a fighting expansionist instinct, or lose your cities to those who did. Nothing. Nothing. Of course, not all of the dead had been a poor fit for the world. Canada had been an underrated example of fighting spirit. Kneecapped before they even got running, they had kept running anyway. Sure, it had been an embarrassing and painful thing to watch, but the more Pedro thought about it, the more he respected it. Survival wasn't about dignity. It was about survival. The biggest event in over a decade happened mid-yawn, and Nazca took Hauyawa. Uruguay appeared not to mind too much. With nothing else to talk about, Pedro had to tolerate the "Hi, you well?" puns from his crew for literally years afterwards. I guess that's how you pronounce it. "Hi, you well?" When he had conquered a cylinder himself, Pedro had done so with compassion and culture. His swaths of soldiers had switched from conquest to carnival as soon as their enemies had been dispatched, and won the hearts and minds of their new civilians. Had Poverty Point conquered the world, perhaps they would have had the same compassion. Unfortunately, their compassion had been a compromising one, allowing their enemies to get away with too much in the name of being nice. Real leadership, even compassionate leadership, meant being uncompromising, and those elders had not lived long enough to learn that. The cylinder kept turning, its borders changing no faster than the tectonic plates beneath them, and that was especially slow given the submarine's power to keep those tectonic plates in position and hold the world together. Cylinders were unfriendly shapes for the formation of a planet where everyone lived on the crust. When the civilizations had run out of room on their own continents to colonize, they had to come to Antarctica. Thankfully, too far away from the nuclear submarine for Pedro to be worried. And what had these empires achieved in the frozen wasteland? About as much as one would predict. As much as they continued to achieve in the rest of the cylinder, that is. In his boredom, Pedro ruminated over the fact that some deaths he felt worse about than others. Ndongo, for example, had fallen from a state of security to extinction in barely any time at all, but it was difficult to feel sorry for them. Declaring war on a troubled neighbor was a smart enough idea, but doing so without an army of your own was foolhardy at best. Overconfidence was the one thing that could overcome smartness, as Nzinga had experienced herself. Suddenly, there was action. Uruguay taking back Hayuel from Nazca, the Apache capturing Kung from the Haida city and cutting off Cyrenaic, and Beta Israel being thrown off their own continent forever. A people who had once occupied the Horn of Africa with pride were reduced to a town called Padme, on the southwest tip of the Arabian Peninsula, so small it could be barely distinguished from Palmyran territory. This is Junior Information Officer Greg 9 stepping in to review the action for a moment while Pedro takes a quick nap. While not many borders have changed the past few years, plenty of cities changed hands since turn 700 when we started. Shikoku in particular lost 5 cities in one turn, which includes the first city nuked entirely out of existence, probably. I estimate around 2 billion citizens have lost their lives in the bloodshed so far. Brutal. For those keeping score, here are the total cities gained and lost. 3 cities have been destroyed, and 7 settled. Here are the leaders in what I consider to be the major categories in the late game. There is a notable shortage of Uruguay on this list. This chart may appear like a bunch of parallel lines at first, but there are some interesting things to note. Beginning with one that will excite, Uruguay is at the bottom of this particular list. As of turn 800, they have the 9th largest military. It also appears that the Moors have finally decided to build a military worthy of their status. The Métis military is a testament to consistency. Production, the ability of a civ to quickly build infrastructure and military, has been relatively stable. As civs reach the end of the tech tree, there are fewer buildings to build that increase this stat. Golden ages are clearly visible and almost constant among most civs. In the face of nuclear hellfire, Shikoku struggles to remain above average in this stat. Thank you, Junior Information Officer Greg, and now back to the story at hand. As sad as it was to see a formerly competent civ become nothing, it was the way of the cylinder. Back in the day, the Sulu had built a formidable navy. When the enormous Tongu had attacked, they had fought back with fantastic enthusiasm. However, melee units were not their thing. With a population almost entirely comprised of ranged fighters, the Sulu had lost their empire because too few of them had been willing to thrust a sword into an opponent up close. And that was probably the fate that had awaited Gutted, leader of the now extinct empire of Beta Israel. A Zimbabwean naval assault had taken Padme, reducing them to the history books. F. Mountain civilizations rarely did well in tournaments like this. Pedro had his own memories of Tibet and Afghanistan, and knew that whereas mountains stunted invading forces, fending off invasions was not enough to win continents. Mountains also stunted your own ability to grow your cities and carpet your lands with soldiers. Their home territory, combined with lackluster military campaigns, had sealed Beta Israel's status as a dead civilization in waiting. After the death of Gutted, the rest of the world continued as if nothing happened. The cylinder was pitiless at times. But then again, pity was no advantage. The Moors and Benin had felt no pity as they had ripped apart one of the cylinder's greatest civilizations, bringing it from glory to extinction in virtually no time at all. Pedro remembered it as the turning point when he, his crew, and presumably every immortal left on the cylinder came to realize that not even the greats were safe. And not even those who slew giants were safe either. Yet Simba Mutota turned her armies west and went straight for 2 Beninese cities. How long until the rest of the continent fell? She had the willpower for it. Of course, there was every possibility that willpower would lead to disaster. The Murray forward settled at the beginning and doomed to be a rump civilization forever, had demonstrated glorious willpower. Things could have been so different had they made peace with Australia just a few years earlier when they had owned half the continent, before Hawk had struck back and wiped them out altogether. Timing was everything, especially when troops were sparse. Apparently, everyone left on the cylinder was biding their time too. The sub fell silent once again. The single Uruguayan submarine had returned with a friend, and an Iroquois sub had followed to see what the fuss was about. Nuclear submarines rarely traveled together. With powers like theirs, they never needed to. There could be only one reason for two of them traveling south together. Pedro marched out of his office and onto the bridge, raised his hand to grab everyone's attention, and whispered the words he had spent 9,000 years hoping he would never say. "We've been discovered." Life on Pedro's submarine took a turn for the more nervous. How could Pedro explain to these people that the cylinder's existence depended on his submarine's survival, and why the hell would they believe him if he did? Thankfully, years passed with no direct threat, other than a great general exploding himself into a cylinder and taking Beninese land. Nothing changed worldwide either. Pedro continued his remembrance of civilizations gone by. When it came to Papua, he was happy that there were things to remember about them. Birthed in a set of islands that had made expansion a challenge, few people had expected much of them. Their out-of-nowhere conquest of Australia had been written about in countless history books, a feat matched only by their out-of-nowhere downfall. Nubia experienced its greatest adventure in centuries, stealing a piece of desert from Benin. Meanwhile, Shikoku, knowing their capital was lost forever, sought expansion opportunities elsewhere, and in true Shikoku style, they made it happen. Greg's note, Nubia gained 2 tiles. This is the first time their tile count changed since turn 608, when they lost 2 tiles. And that was what the story of the cylinder was. Civilization seeking impossible tasks and making them happen. Success was rarely down to sheer numbers and more about choices. Choice, of course, had been Chechia's downfall. More specifically, the choice to give away their second city completely for free and voluntarily cutting their own empire in 2. Great leaders were largely remembered by their choices. Pedro was glad his own time as a war leader had not been remembered by something as humiliating as Václav Havel's. Just for once, Benin chose to expand outwards rather than contract inwards. Risking another war with the great Zimbabwean Empire, Uare took a bite and watched to see what happened. The rest of the world sat around doing nothing. If Pedro had learned one thing from his own fighting days, he knew that doing nothing often generated a lot of hype. The Yakutian Empire had been enormous back in its day, before doing nothing and becoming nothing. And then came Uruguay, the nightmare of most across the cylinder, and presumed winner of the tournament before it even got rolling. But incredibly, for all their high production, population, and military, Uruguay had sent nobody at all to the redundant sofa. Nobody. Benin, having not suffered much from taking that first bite, bit again and took one of their own cities back. The Manx bit back too, avenging the death of their glorious Kirkmichael or something. Uruguay naturally did nothing. There was one civilization that had been credited above all others for Uruguay's ineffectiveness. The Kwikuru of the rainforest, targets of too many wars and repellent of too many Uruguayan soldiers, had once been seen as the shield of the world. Nobody on the cylinder had expected the dormant Nazca to be the ones to stab them in the back, wipe them out of existence, and open the rest of the world to the Uruguayan menace, who then did nothing. But it seemed like Juan Antonio Lavalleja was waking up. The feared annihilation of South America had not happened, but the occasional Nazca city fell. The citizens of Kohakugu were probably wishing that the Kwikuru wall had still been around. But whereas some civilizations had been walls, others had been welcome mats. Korea, who had given away their second city to a lazy little tribe known as the Kamugs, had been quite welcoming in letting the Shikoku share their land. It had been the moment the cylinder had recognized the true potential of Sakamoto Ryoma. Pedro tried to imagine the shame of an immortal existing solely to demonstrate the power of another immortal, like in his own time, when the Timurids had existed only to demonstrate the might of Sibir. Timurids, who were they? 5 years passed, and everyone did nothing. Uruguay, Palmyra, Chile, Venezuela. But none of them had got there by doing nothing. Their nothingness was on the back of a hell of a lot of effort. Venezuela were doing nothing while sat on the lands that they had conquered, not least Haiti, whose downfall had been shocking. In the blink of an eye, they had gone from the greatest extent to non-existence, mainly due to an enormous Venezuelan strike, although history would blame it on their inability to conquer the Venezuelan capital thousands of years before. Fools. Benin bit twice. The equatorial cities of Mambone and Kandonga fell. It was daring from a civilization inferior to Zimbabwe in just about every measurable way. Gragg's note: at this point, Benin has 26% the production and military as Zimbabwe, and 43% of the cities. Zimbabwe has 4 units for every one of Benin, and can produce more than 4 times as fast. Generally speaking, of course. And being daring was fine as long as it was backed up. The Qing had been daring by settling half their cities in the north of their continent rather than waste time scrambling for land already split between 4 leaders. But instead of filling up the land in the middle, their northern empire had simply become a cold place for them to die, brought down by civilizations who were more than used to the cold of the north. Despite the risk of being overheard by searching submarines, Pedro's crew were gasping loudly. What was Benin doing in the heart of Zimbabwean territory? And when would the inevitable Zimbabwean counterstrike begin? Dambarare and Macardone, 2 central cities founded by Zimbabwe, had fallen, bringing the Beninese expansion to 5. At that moment, Zimbabwe's military incompetence was rivaling that of the Golden Horde, a comparison which was widely used as an insult on the submarine. Toktamish and Alaric had fought down the centuries, each as ineffective as the other before the Goths had found their footing and learned how to fight properly. Perhaps they had learned a lot about siege tactics while invading the Golden Horde, who had left their cities open for them to practice. The voluntary throwaway of further cities had made everyone else lose their ability to take the Horde seriously, until the Parthian army had put them out of their misery. Benin took Kabasa, the former Ndongo capital. Whether Zimbabwe was even trying to resist, Pedro could not tell. This was progress. Meaningful, frightening progress. In tournaments where competitors went extinct, it was important to define what progress actually meant. The Seljuks had become stronger than 20 other civilizations from their lowest point onwards, but only in the same way that a newborn baby was stronger than a dead man. Pedro, in one of his dreams about albinos riding dinos, had laughed at the mental image of a stock exchange based on how the civilizations ranked against each other, and how rich people could have got by putting their money on those who made meaningless progress. Back in the present, Benin's true progress had stalled. That was okay. There was a lot of breath to catch and a lot of territory to safeguard. Benin was making it easier for themselves by minimizing the lengths of their borders. The more circular their empire, the less invasion points there were. That had been Muscovy's downfall, that even when facing the then incompetent Goths, their doom was made inevitable by the sheer length of their linear border. Even the Sami, who Pedro had not given a passing thought to in 100 years, had fought their way through it. Benin may have fought through traditionally Ndongo lands, but plenty of their new cities were ones that Zimbabwe had founded themselves. That made Pedro smile. There was a huge morale difference between populations who lived on their own land and those who had been ejected from it. The Holy Roman Empire, for example, had long lost the palace where its first couple of emperors had sat. It had become a tragic existence, spending their final days in somebody else's former city, and to add insult to injury, not even a city that had been legitimately conquered, merely given to them based on a threat that hadn't been there. Little happened in the following years, except for the events so small they made no impact on Pedro's screen. And to be fair, some significant events made very little visual difference. Like the death of Beta Israel, the death of the Seljuks had barely registered on this map. When Pedro tried to remember the Seljuk story, all he remembered was how they had existed in their final few centuries, and there wasn't much to remember about that either. Some empires had not earned their place in history. The civilizations that actually had earned their place were taking full advantage. Biding their time, they seemed to want to stay in history for as long as possible, even if it meant inaction. Once upon a time, the Aztecs had existed. Pedro remembered a lot of shouting, but that was it. The Venetians returned to Manx lands for their annual festival of remembering a man named Kirk Michael, a fictional folk hero who they burned on a bonfire every year or something bizarre that nobody questioned the origins of. On those crazy islands, it was difficult to tell which part of their culture were true and what history had been made up for itself. Over thousands of years, Pedro had found much to mourn. The passing of great civilizations, the passing of civilizations who had never become great, and, like now, the mourning of lost opportunities. The north of Asia had been full of promise, of interesting land and expansion opportunities. Pedro mourned the fact that such promising land had lain empty for so long. If only another civilization had been here to fill the land with history and culture. And on turn 895, nothing happened. Tonga's death didn't seem that long ago, only hundreds of years rather than thousands. They had had a roller coaster experience, barely bothering to expand at all in their early days, but not appearing to suffer from it. But with such a limited area of land and such limited competence in warfare, Tonga's time had come and gone. Uruguay pressed further north and took back San Jose de Mayo, but that was the least of Pedro's concerns. Somewhere across the mountains, trouble was brewing. As more civs became aware of the sub, they began to jam our information gathering systems. Starting bonuses are determined from turn 900, and I have access to data up to turn 880. Looking at the maps, it's safe to assume stats remain generally the same. Here are the leaders in each category going into endgame. Australia is a clear stats leader, but is burdened with a bad start location for endgame. Iroquois are finally catching up in military. Zimbabwe has been decimated by Benin, still in shock about that, and Shikoku are still relatively okay if you look at only numbers. This chart really drives home how rough this war has been for Zimbabwe. They've gone from 4th in military to 9th over the course of it. What happens if an actual power were to attack them? Tongu had an interesting spike as well to just overtake Moors. Finally, are Uruguay the real Boers? There is no production chart because they remained surprisingly consistent. Zimbabwe is of course tumbled, but otherwise there are no major changes. And here are the total city count changes over the course of the episode. China the big winner, followed by the Benin of all civs. Anyone not listed ended up with a net of 0 cities changed. I'll end my observations with a glimpse at the biggest winners of this summary episode. We've talked a lot about some of the major players, but there are a few surprises here that snuck in under the radar. There were more of them now. A multinational effort to investigate the disturbance at the bottom of the world. Submarines were not the most efficient vehicles for carving through the ice, but nonetheless they were trying. Pick by pick, the ice shelves surrounding the mountains were being cut away. It was okay for now. Centuries would pass before first contact. But the centuries passed regardless. Benin spread further into Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe stole desert from Palmyra. Uruguay tore through the center of the Nazca Empire and picked cities from New Zealand. The Chin took the Goth city of Nuwakot, near Nepal. The Yupik lost Tlacopan, their only city where its citizens didn't need coats. Somehow, Kawes, the former Soknum capital, fell to the Venetians of all people. Well, purple is my favorite color. And to celebrate this, the festival of killing Kirk Michael spread further, and each year the Venetians started to peel Kirk Michael, or something like that. The centuries passed, and Pedro, in the midst of it all, couldn't move. Then the world came. The last of the ice was carved away. Scouts were sent on the treks through the mountains until they returned back to their subs with tales, and thermal images of a Brazilian nuclear submarine stuck in a lake. As one, the surviving civilizations merged. Uruguay was there, the Iroquois were there, Venice and the Manx were there, Venezuela and Shikoku and Australia and New Zealand were there, all armed, all curious. "You cannot destroy this submarine," Pedro had wailed into his radio once contact had been established. "If we die, the cylinder dies with us." That sentence had been taken as a threat rather than a clarification. 33 civilizations, none of which knew the slightest thing about nuclear tectonic bonding, stopped focusing on each other for the first time in 9,000 years. The day came when the world made its decision. Through the radio in his office, Pedro heard the shrill, shrieking, overexcited voice of Indira Gandhi. "By 6 p.m. you will surrender your technology, your freedom, and your existence to us, or we will send every nuclear missile right in your direction and wipe every trace of you from history." The cylinder's annals had held their fair share of mistakes, but together the world had made its biggest mistake of all. They had given him until 6 p.m. The job was done. He had spared only those who lived in the most well-guarded centers of each civilization's capital and wiped the rest of the world clean. It was the only way. He spent the rest of the day whispering to himself over and over. And he had been right. If one shred of nuclear technology had remained, the cylinder's existence would remain in danger. But the threat was gone now. The survivors would have another 9,000 years to forget about the mythical submarine at the bottom of the world. It would become another folktale, passed down the generations until everyone had forgotten what it meant. Meanwhile, the civilizations would rebuild, re-expand, rediscover, and continue to do what they had done best since time immemorial, attacking the hell out of each other until only one glorious civilization remained. Pedro returned to his office, sat down at his computer screen, and began to watch. And with that ends episode 37. I want to personally thank Autistic Not Weird and Greg9 for all of their effort in putting this unique part together. It was a look back, and I'm so proud that we came all this way in 37 episodes. I think Mark II was like 180 or something like that. So we're really trying to spice things up more quickly. So, that is the end of traditional episodes for the time being. Next time we meet, which I'm not sure if we're taking a week off or if we are going to be back next week, I will let you know. If we are not here next week, then you know. It's Endgame. I talked about it at the end of the episode last week, but Endgame is essentially the reset button, as the game has become too cramped and crowded and filled with junk that nothing could process, so Pedro decided to do a reset. So all of the remaining civs are in existence at the capitals that they had at the end of the game, and they are sent off to rebuild and redestroy one another. All the civs that did very well, they are going to have some kind of added bonus to them, so there is some balance there. But I'm looking forward to this next part, this next chapter in this season. I'm very excited to see what you guys think, and very excited to see how it is concluded and who actually wins. But until then, my name is Dawkinzz. We'll see you next time.